Oh well. Hello there. Don't panic, I haven't retired yet. I'm digging through the trash not to find any bottles to turn in. I'm looking for evidence. See, politics is a little bit like a murder mystery. Everybody's got a theory about what the world is and what it's supposed to be. Everybody's got a suspect. And there's one particular suspect that frightens people more than all the others combined. If you ask a progressive libtard what fascism is, you'll get a list of people that he doesn't like. And if you ask a YouTube historian with a map animation and a concerned voice, you'll get something like authoritarianism plus nationalism. A definition that just happens to describe about 99% of every government that has ever existed. Ask an academic, and you get to watch a grown man with a doctorate spend 40 minutes either boiling fascism down to one thing that it obviously wasn't, or quietly inventing the missing pieces so that his story closes in the right direction. And if you're really unlucky, he'll read you Umberto Eco's 14 points. Everyone is completely certain that it's the worst thing that has ever existed. Yet, practically nobody can tell us what it actually was. That should bother us more than it does. We don't normally struggle to define the things that we hate. Communism, one sentence. Theocracy, one sentence. Monarchy, one sentence. But fascism keeps slipping through our fingers, somehow. So, before we spend 40 minutes poking around in the fog, I'd like to hand you a little tool. For the length of this video, don't treat the word fascism as the enemy marker that it actually has become. Instead, try to treat it like a Geiger counter, a measuring instrument that you hold naturally against something, and it will click when there's something there. Everybody will, obviously, point it at their political opponent. Oh, you're fascist in this way, X, Y, and Z. But somehow, the reading will never quite come out right. So why does it keep evading a clear definition for the modern man? There's actually two reasons for it. Both are rather obvious. The first one is that fascism is deliberately built to sit outside the left and right spectrum that we use to define everything else. It marketed itself as a third way. Something engineered specifically to escape your coordinate system is by definition hard to plot in said coordinate system. Fine, granted. Secondly, National Socialism. See, the two get welded together in people's heads all the time. Fascist essentially just means the History Channel's favorite 12 years with the Austrian painter. And at that moment, the political philosophy vanishes behind the worst image of the 20th century, while nobody really dares to look at the machine behind it anymore. Well, that is exactly what we're gonna do today. Now, we won't look at the aesthetics, but rather at the principles that hold the thing together. There are only a few, but once you've seen them, the answer to why nobody can really define fascism gets deeply uncomfortable. Now, the first one is rather well known. It is that the state is all there is. Mussolini and Gentile wrote about it without really blinking. The state is all embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist. Now, because most people will skim past it as standard dictator bluster, but it really isn't. It is actually the core metaphysical claim of the idea, and it has a consequence that almost nobody really dares to spell out. If no value can exist outside of the state, then the nation is not something that the state serves. It is instead something that the state defines. Everybody else in history put the nation before the government, in blood, in soil and language, in a shared cult. In 1,000 years of dead grandfathers underneath their feet. Yet the fascist relocates it. For him, the nation is whatever the apparatus says it is, and the apparatus says so on its own authority, which is exactly why calling fascism nationalist or traditionalist is kind of a category error. It wears this very costume, for sure, but it doesn't really own any of these labels. A traditionalist would believe that the nation came before him and outranks him. The fascist believes that the nation comes out of the office that issues the stamps. Now picture a state that claims to be the servant of the nation, while reserving to itself the sole right to decide what this nation is. This is principle 1. The state doesn't really belong to the nation. The nation belongs to the administration. You do well to write that down. That's going to be important for the final. Now the second principle is the third way, in your wallet. If the state is the highest value, you can't really leave the economy to the market alone, and you can't really hand it to a class either. So the fascist throws out both of its neighbors. Liberal capitalism he despises as selfish, atomized individuals chasing private profit, acknowledging nothing above themselves. The Marxist class struggle, on the other hand, he despises as international. It is a loyalty that runs sideways across borders to other workers, instead of upward to the state, which puts it permanently outside of its control. That's the actual objection to socialism for the fascist, by the way, not some deep love of property. Now, out of this critique, the fascist builds the synthesis. It is corporatism, but since nobody really uses that word anymore, here's what it actually concretely means. Private property stays. He is not naive enough to abolish it, but it comes under, you can call it oversight. Employers and workers get organized into bodies that negotiate with each other, and the negotiation happens under the eye of the state, with its own goals at first place. On paper, this establishes harmony. No more class wars, everybody's pulling on the same rope. In practice, however, it does something different. See the large firms that can afford a seat at that very table, fuse with the operators, and harvest every advantage going. The small businesses and the ordinary worker get buried under exactly the regulation that this fusion produces. The state plays both sides against each other, using the workers' grievance to get leverage over the firms, and the firms' distress to get leverage over the workers, and every single round is won by the same conglomerate. It is the state, plus the companies close enough to count as family. Picture a state that farms the natural tension between employer and employee, that lives off both sides of a fight that it has no interest whatsoever in resolving, because it allows it to expand ever more. It is principle 2, neither market nor class, a permanent conflict as the administration's permanent revenue stream for its own power. The third one is the balancing act. Now, this is the part that a lot of people will leave out when talking about fascism, even though it explains a lot of the texture. In Italy, the historical fascists ran into a wall. His own population was deeply religious, Catholic to the bone in fact, which means there is a set of competing ideas, of values outside of the state, which is, by its own doctrine, impossible. And his most important ally, the autistic Germans on the border, defined the nation in strictly racial terms, so biological and therefore prior to any bureaucracy, which flatly contradicted the claim that the apparatus decides who the people are. So the all-embracing state spent enormous energy publicly not being all-embracing, a permanent balancing act between a moral base that it couldn't swallow and a radical ally that it didn't want to lose. Now, remember that shape, because it essentially embodies the administrative center that is permanently brokering between a quasi-religious moral fervor beneath it and a racially charged radicalism beside it. It is principle 3. The apparatus will always negotiate with the forces that it cannot control in order to advance its own influence, and it will call all of that its own principles. Now, all of this does sound rather familiar, doesn't it? Right, let's lay all these principles out side by side and read them very slowly. An all-embracing state that appoints itself sole arbiter of morality, culture and economics. Politics elevated into the religion of the masses, with heretics, with sacraments, with excommunication, with people losing their jobs and, in the case of fascist Italy, a little bit more than that, for failing to recite the correct dogma. An economy that is neither honestly capitalist nor honestly socialist, but rather fusion, in which enormous corporations work hand in glove with the government, and together they flatten everything that can ever be underneath them that might have competed. A bureaucracy convinced it has the authority to decide what the nation is, to issue the definition of a people and revoke it again, from the office that prints the forms, read them in the founding documents, and in daily life the quiet requirement that you hold the correct license to do, own, build or say anything at all, and a moral administrative center that performs exactly this balancing act, the brokering between a fervent, quasi-religious base beneath it and an explicitly race-conscious actor beside it. Tell me honestly, which country you have just described? It is likely your own. There's exactly one principle of the historical fascists that doesn't really map cleanly onto the modern West, and that is autarky. Now, it is kind of silly to bring this point, actually, because the drive to become economically self-sufficient, independent of the outside, is rather normal. But even here, we can argue why the fascists did it. See, they wanted to decouple from the dependence on rival powers while trading happily with their friends. Sanctions regimes, friend shoring, strategic resource consolidation, to cut off the rival and deepen your own bloc. That is precisely what we do, which isn't a condemnation necessarily, because naturally that seems to be fairly normal behavior at the international level. We simply have fewer declared enemies and considerably less appetite for keeping our own industry alive while we do it. Now, what is actually left if we just subtract everything that matches today with back then? Let's take a closer look at the one undeniable structural difference between historical fascism and the society that we're currently sitting in. It is paternalism, the masculine hierarchical vertical character of the one thing, against the feminine egalitarian therapeutic safety-obsessed administrative apparatus of modernity that makes everything fake and gay. That is the residue. It is genuinely all that's left between these two positions, which gets us somewhere unpleasant. Fascism appears to be the modern West without the rainbow flags, and with an open commitment to hierarchy and its identity. The ideology that we are trained from childhood to regard as the absolute floor of human evil mirrors us in nearly every structural detail, and the only reliable difference between the worst imaginable system and the present day is the testosterone level. Should it really surprise us that we struggle to define this very thing, as, well, you seem to always describe badly the thing that you're currently standing inside, the fish in water kind of thing. All of this brings us to where things get properly uncomfortable, because we need to take a look at when the West became like this, and it doesn't appear to be despite the victory over fascism, but because of it. In 1945, the victors looked at what they just buried and swore the oath that has governed everything ever since: never again. Out of that, they built a civilization around this very oath. The problem is that never again isn't really a vision for the future, it is a negation, and a negation has no form of its own. So, when the West reached for the instruments that would make fascism impossible forever, it has reached for the only instruments that function at this very scale. It is permanent administration, technocratic management, and the harmonization of law, of money, and eventually of morality across borders. Bretton Woods, the UN, NATO, the rules-based order, the alphabet agencies at home, and above all, a class of experts standing above the dangerous passions of mere nations, so those nations can never get dangerous again. We built, in other words, the managerial state, and we intended it as the cure. The European Union is the purest specimen of this problem. Conceived explicitly against nationalism and war, it has grown into an unelected commission that issues binding laws across a continent, harmonizes everything within reach, and ever more openly claims the right to decide what a nation is permitted to be or think, which values are European and which ones get corrected from above. A body that claims to serve the nations while reserving to itself the sole right to define them. Ever closer union isn't just a slogan for them, it is a direction of travel. It is precisely the ever-approaching bureaucratic machine that conservatives have been pointing at for a long time. And for things to go this way, you need no evil will, no conspiracy, no secret fascist in Brussels or Washington. You only need a procedure. The project built to prevent fascism kept the entire skeleton and just swapped the face, which leaves the only question that really matters. How the hell did we build a thing by trying to abolish it? Now, at an open-ended question like this, a lot of essays would stop. Big reveal. It's been fascism all along, guys. An outro and the Patreon link, which is in the description, by the way, for those of you who want to support the work. But we are nowhere near done here. The reveal is rather true. It's just shallow, because it implies somebody chose all of this, that someone slipped the fascist machine under us while we weren't looking. A conspiracy, betrayal, a wrong turn. But that really isn't it. Nobody chose all of that, and it's genuinely the disturbing part. Let's start with a sentence that sounds rather dry and turns out to be anything but. A form of government is, before anything else, the expression of the technological capacity of its age. Not its ideals, not its slogans, its capacities, what the available technology makes possible, and eventually necessary to organize around. Now that very sentence does something fairly violent to the usual story. We like to picture ideologies as blueprints. Someone dreams up the just society and then builds it by will. Historically, however, that has essentially never happened. One of my favorite examples for this failure is Marxism. See, it explicitly promised the withering away of the state. The dictatorship of the proletariat was supposed to be a phase. Afterwards, the administration of things replaces the government of men, and the apparatus dissolves. That's what it says here, right in my workers' Quran. But what did trying to force exactly that into existence actually produce? The most total, most invasive, largest bureaucratic state this planet has ever seen. The ideology aimed at no state at all in the end, yet it manufactured the biggest one in history. Marxists simply cannot be right, it appears. But why? Well, because feeding, housing, mobilizing and coordinating tens of millions of industrialized people is a technical problem, and a technical problem has only a limited amount of technical solutions. The scale and the machinery select the form of the government. A communist would call all of this the material necessity, which is just Marxist cope and means it is what it is. You can walk in through any ideological door of your liking, liberal, communist, even the fascist framework, and yet the corridor will always narrow down into the same room. Modern industrialist societies require an enormous administrative apparatus that is run by a class of managers, planners and technicians who are neither owners nor workers, and who exist purely because the complexity of the system demands it. That is precisely what James Burnham's thesis in 1941 stipulated. And Burnham was an ex-Trotskyist, so a Marxist, who switched sides, which fits our topic perfectly. A man who observed the left and right-wing synthesis by becoming it. His claim was that capitalism isn't being replaced by socialism. Instead, both seem to be overtaken by managerialism, and he seems to be right. It is the rule by the administrative class, and the New Deal America, Stalin's UdSSR, and National Socialist Germany are all dialectics of the same emerging language. Three regimes that hated each other to the bone, to the point of total war in fact, are converging on the very same managerial state, because 20th century technology only permitted this form to survive at that scale. Now, Spengler had already said this in a more interesting fashion. Technology is not a tool a culture uses, he says. It is the destiny a culture is, and the late form of every culture is identical. The rule of money gives way to the rule of the administration and force, and Caesarism wears whatever mask is locally available. The soul thinks it's steering, and it is being carried instead. Now, I don't really agree with this, but it is a rather interesting point to make nonetheless, because, well, our current rulers are, in the case of America, a businessman, and when we look at Germany, our chancellor is, well, a BlackRock clown. Now, to put it through my own lens, I'd like to, fittingly for today's topic, pull out the famous court wizard and card-carrying super-fascist Julius Evola out of my sleeve. On the traditionalist reading, what happened in our order is that the priest was pressed into the manager, the class whose only job was to generate the measure from outside of itself. It is the thing that allows you to measure power against itself. It was replaced by a class that only administers, and into this very vacuum stepped the merchant, who turned meaning into product, which is why our current politics today is either decided by hedonistic materialism or a substitute spirituality that is draped over the very exact managerial class. These are the guys that want to turn everything fake and gay. There is no really third item on the menu anymore. As such, the form our government takes isn't really chosen, it is selected. Governance structures that don't really fit the technological substrate of the age get sorted out and die out, not refuted, not voted out. They get filtered, and the one that fits reproduces. Our systems seem to be creeping towards a form of fascist structure, in essence, even in societies that were specifically trying to avoid them. Technology selects the form, but how concretely? By exactly what mechanism does a free people, well, if there's anything like that, walk into the total state? Because so far nobody has really shown us the door, but I know the way. See, the first reason is rather obvious. That is the mass movements that arrived in the 20th century. There's really no alternative to them. Before industrial technology, you could not really move millions of people as easily. Maybe a city or a grand army briefly, but it was, well, only possible when you're angry enough. That was essentially the logistical ceiling. Anything beyond it was physically impossible because the information didn't travel fast enough and the bodies weren't reachable. Railways, mass literacy, the newspaper, then the radio, then the broadcast, and ultimately your feed. Every step cut the cost of mobilizing a mass. Today, you assemble a continent-wide movement from your phone in an afternoon. Yes. People are, of course, better informed than ever. And more educated for sure. Well, let's leave that one standing where it is for today. The actual problem, however, is what follows from it. Because a mass is not really the opposite of the total state. It is rather the raw material for it. See, what makes a mass is precisely that it has no internal structure by itself. No real estates, no guilds, no generally local authorities, and no intermediate body standing between them and the individual at the center. It is essentially atomized individuals accumulated and added together, and a sum of atomized individuals can only really be organized from a single point on, either the originating one or the one who can decide, because there's nothing really left inside of the mass that is capable of organizing itself. So every mass movement ever, whatever flag it marches under, whether it demands liberation or order, delivers pre-atomized material straight to the center, and then will ask the center to act. That is the first reason. It might sound not that important, but it'll get rather important later on. The second one is something that we in the West execute in the single most idiotic way imaginable. In fact, most people can't even imagine it. And well, that is the combination of the mass phenomena and liberal democracy. See, liberal democracy tells itself that it defeated totalitarianism, and that it defeated it with total freedom. Now, freedom is a funny word. It is the antidote, of course. More freedom therefore means less total state, right? By its very definition. Right, my fellow liberals? Well, except what is freedom? Not a moral statute that comes from outside of the state. Not from God. I'm told that guy is dead. Not from nature. Not from an inherited order standing above the sovereign. In the modern West, freedom is a right. And a right is a claim. And any claim without a guarantor is worth exactly nothing. And the guarantor, my dear friends, is the state. You can already smell it, can't you? Every freedom, one, has to be administered, adjudicated, enforced against anyone who might infringe upon it. Rights collide with other rights, so you need arbitration bodies, and the number of possible collisions grows combinatorially with the number of rights. Every single expansion of liberalization enlarges the apparatus that administers it, not as an unfortunate side effect, but as the mechanism itself. And this is why so many people feel a contradiction that they can't really name when they look at modern politics. See, rights for trans people in Europe, for example, or rather in Germany, I suppose, they get guaranteed. And what comes out of the other end is a body of law and an administrative practice in which forms of address carry legal weight, in which the wrong word or the dead name in the wrong context can become actionable. And the liberal will tell you that all of this is also very liberal. The poor trans people now liberated, emancipated from your moral bigotry. And he isn't lying, really. He's just not finishing the sentence. To guarantee an individual's right, you need an apparatus with the authority to enforce it against everybody else. Now, the right and the enforcement apparatus are not two things. They are one thing, seen from two ends. Any right, without anybody that can guarantee it, does not exist. Now, if you run this liberalization, the emancipation of the individual, all the way to its logical endpoint, then you arrive not at a free man in an open field breathing the fresh air. Instead, you will arrive at the situation of the guarantor, the coronation of the state. One single total institution standing as guarantor of everything. Sole source and sole arbiter of every value, because by then every value has been reformulated as a right, and every right runs through it, and naturally every right will have to permeate the individual as the single most important unit of society, and thus the state, the rights it guarantees, and the procedures that it invokes are all creeping into the individual life. Oh, doesn't this remind us of something? The state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual value can exist. Gentile wanted to force that through the will of the nation. Liberalism instead produces it through the procedure, and it would appear that procedure is much more thorough than any will of the nation could ever be, because nobody has to agree to it. Nobody even has to notice it. The process just creeps along into the general nonsense of modernity. Everyone has the right to vote. Everyone is included. Everybody should voice their opinion. But all of a sudden, the longer the dance goes, democracy starts demanding some rather peculiar things. The correct voting pattern, denying certain people their stage, or their word, or the right to speak. Well. Which brings me, grinning, to one of my favorite philosophical clowns of the modern day. He, just like Evola, will get his own video in the coming weeks, don't you worry. But to light up this creeping process properly, we land on Nick Land. He's one of the most schizoid people, and by far the funniest writers alive. I don't really agree with him at all. Nick Land has a concept that he sometimes calls Genon. It is nature, or nature's god, roughly the impersonal order of what actually survives. Not what's just and not what's nice, not what you voted for, but what works, selected blindly and without mercy. It is the way that evolution selects without asking the organism about its preferences first. In Lance telling, and you have to picture this delivered with the mania of a man who finds the apocalypse deeply hilarious, there is something like a deeper logic of governance. It is a process, an intelligence, that is busy actualizing itself through the capacities of progress. That's right, we are building something. We think that we are writing history, but instead it would appear that we are the paper that history is being written on by something else. Capital, computation, and administration, those aren't really our instruments. Oh no, we are the early hardware for a god that is assembling itself. That's right, the AI god of the future, in fact, is using our institutions as scaffolding and our ideologies as a cover story. God, I love that guy, dude. The schizomexing is truly at peak levels. Now, it's a completely deranged idea, but yet it also seems to unfortunately be a fairly good description of what's happening out there. Every faction, in fact, that is ever fighting on the political scene believes that it's fighting the machine, and every victorious faction turns itself into a load-bearing wall for exactly this machine after they win. The process doesn't really care what slogan you marched under, it only asks whether the structure that you build is fit enough to keep on running. And the managerial state is extremely fit, it would appear. It eats every shock, it absorbs every revolution, and it comes out slightly larger every time. So, what I'm saying is that we didn't really install fascism. It is something much worse. It would appear that we grew it. Unintentionally, blindly, and in many cases precisely by sincerely attempting the opposite. The thing actualized itself through our progress, exactly as Nick Land would describe it. And it had picked the managerial body because that's the only body that has really survived at this technological altitude for this long. But more on that in its own video. However, it is rather fitting that Land published most of these ideas not in Oxford where he started, but in Shanghai. He walked out of the Western University and moved into the most advanced specimen of the current modern machine on the planet. It is a former communist state that fits the fascist blueprint perfectly, which is genuinely remarkable if you think about it, given the fact that fascism was conceived to replace socialism, and that the Marxists and socialists alike hate fascism. Yet, it seems to be its endpoint. Thus, our journey continues to China. Everything that we have described so far is something that the West does apologetically. We build the managerial state while swearing blind that it's building the opposite, that we are doing anything but behind the rainbow flags in the therapeutic register with endless reassurance that this is freedom, that this is just a choice, that this is the open society, keeping the whole thing padded, fake and gay, maximally inclusive. All of that is just not a stylistic preference for us, it is in fact compulsory. That obligation, however, generates a serious amount of friction, because the machine in the West runs with a guilty conscience bolted to the front of it, and that breaks the gears quite significantly. Every expansion has to be smuggled, quietly, past the founding myth, past the rights, past the individual, past the inherited distrust of power that the West simply cannot really shake off. China doesn't really carry any of that. There, the party state is openly fused with the corporate champions, and nobody really is asked to pretend otherwise. The administrative apparatus is the most complete instrument of informational control ever assembled. It is a system that registers, sorts, and steers a fifth of humanity at a resolution that every interior minister of the 20th century could only dream about. And there is no real fiction whatsoever that the nation precedes the party. The party defines the nation openly as declared policy. Even the constitutive people gets cultivated to fit. The Han Chinese are the standard, against which everyone else is a deviation to be corrected. That is how it works over there. All of that is principle number 1, said out aloud, with no embarrassment whatsoever, no story to hide behind it. The state is everything, and you will be happy. China is simply what the managerial state looks like once you strip the cover story of it. And here the Landian punchline writes itself, doesn't it? The process actualizes fastest exactly where there is the least amount of liberal friction that is left to resist it. The West drags its dead founding myth behind it, slows down to a crawl, and wrestles with itself over every single camera that it puts down. China, however, kept the goal and threw away all the guilt. Tens of millions dead in the Great Leap Forward? Well, have you ever seen or read a Wikipedia article on a medieval Chinese civil war?
Chinese history be like. Chao Ling takes power. 247 million perish.
Chinese history be like, Golden Jade Emperor Wang Jina leads an army of 100 million troops into Red Dragon Pass against rebel leader Warlord the Wok and his army of 1 billion in the War of Heavenly Unification. 40 trillion casualties, civilians eaten alive, minor strategic decisive tactical victory. Status Mandate of Heaven. The Kung Pao Emperor dies from his court eunuch due to political intrigue. China splits into 1,000 warring states. Soon conquered by the Red Panda Khanate for 1,000 years, a new dynasty is established. Northern barbarians settle down, adopt Chinese customs, and marry Chinese noblewomen. My face when the barbarians slowly become Chinese. Decisive Mandate of Heaven victory.
Yeah, they don't really seem to care that much, do they? With that inhibition simply absent, the whole development accelerates cleanly and frictionlessly toward exactly what the entire industrialized world seems to be converging on since Burnham first noticed it. The most advanced specimen of the structure is the one thing that never really had to lie about it. So if you want to know what the West is really turning into, don't study the West. We are still trying to tell ourselves a bedtime story about freedom and open societies and liberal procedures. We should instead study the place that stopped lying to itself and accept that the form might not be negotiable, but the content very much is. Remember the Geiger counter from the beginning. Yeah, everyone I don't like is a fascist. That's how it works these days. Ask the libertarian or the classical liberal what's going wrong, and he will tell us that the state is overreaching, metastasizing into private life, regulating the air that you breathe. And he's right. Asking a communist, he will tell you that the state is the loyal servant of capital, fused with the big corporations covering the owners against the people. And he's also right. Ask the conservative and he will tell you that the state is dissolving exactly those older, deeper bonds, family, faith and inherited limits, which were the only things ever capable of stopping it. And he is, sadly, right as well. These seem to describe a completely different monster each time you ask them. Or so you would think. The overreach, the corporate fusion, the dissolution of every competing authority, those aren't three problems of different ideas, are they? They are the faces of one very particular structure, felt from three different positions around it. The managerial state, the third way, that won out in the end. It is the unavoidable synthesis that came out of the collision. It appears to be the unavoidable synthesis that came out of the collision between left and right. I present to you the center. Oh yes, you know exactly what I mean. A situation that nobody really likes, not even the fascists themselves. Each of them catches a piece of the notion, and none of them will say the word properly because the word is under quarantine, made unsayable, or boiled down into a slur for the other team, which is exactly why the process can keep advancing unobstructed. The most effective disguise this machine has ever worn is that it can make its own structures undefinable, except, well, there's a fourth man in the room who doesn't really give a damn. And he isn't blind at all. It is the Chinese planner. He felt the exact same animal as the other three, the elephant in the room. He just did one thing that no Westerner would ever do. He found the light switch, looked the elephant in the eye, climbed onto its back and took the reins. He is the only man in the building who would tell you casually what it is, because he is the only one who is not afraid of it. Probably because the people that used to be afraid of it, they put into, well, adult daycare centers, you could say. Now, every position has its endpoint, which is why all of this is so enormously important to understand. See, I talk about the end position of one's own ideas constantly here, including when I debate with people, for this very reason. What does the world look like when your idea is thought through to the logical end? Very few people dare to answer that. Most don't dare to think about it. But every modern position, once it stops being an opinion and manifests itself in the world, has a direct endpoint that it manifests on its own, not a corridor of possible outcomes depending on who is currently in charge and how nice he is. One clear endpoint. And your ideas arrive there whether or not anyone wants it or not. Because the idea that you have isn't really yours. You are the one being taken over by this idea. Like a god almost, like Nick Land would say, that doesn't really exist yet. We pray to our ideas, and without us having to want it directly, it slowly manifests itself through us. Liberalism, thought to its logical conclusion, will land at the guarantor state, more precisely, at Giovanni Gentili's understanding of fascism. It is that the government and the individual essentially permeate each other at any level. It is the democracy par excellence. We walked through the mechanism step by step today. The individual gets liberated exactly as far as to the point where his liberation requires a total institution to stand behind it, and before you know it, the state guarantees every right, and every right is good, because the state guarantees it. Nothing outside of the state. Welcome to fascism, friends. Well, the socialist ambition lands in the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it appears to stay there. The withering away of the state structure is impossible in modernity. The apparatus built to administer the transitional phase has no reason whatsoever to dissolve itself, and every reason not to dissolve. And since it permits no competing ideas, so no religions, no counterpositions, there's nobody really left above it that could ever force or convince it to dissolve. Now, the right wing, that is where it's rather interesting at the moment. See, the reactionary counterposition that doesn't really spring from a genuine spiritual conviction lands in an oligarchy. These are the Thiel and Musk maxers, or in a crypto aristocracy if you want to call it like this. It is a dressed up rule of whoever currently holds the assets, because materialism is the religion of the time, and thus the merchant is really the only validating principle. Because if you defend hierarchy without any transcendent justification for this hierarchy, what you are actually defending is whoever happens to be standing on top of the material order at the current time. The order is quietly becoming a synonym for the current distribution of property, because we live in the age of the merchant and the administrator. The tech bro is the ultimate synthesis of these two positions, and the tradition they would like to sell you on some Instagram reel becomes the marketing department. These are three terminal endpoints, and there seem to be no exceptions available in this age. The priest was dissolved into the administrator, and what we still believe in is the material world. The priest is the merchant, consumption is the god, and the administrators of the arrangement are the ruling class. The priestly function, and I mean the function, not the man in the robes, was to generate the measure from outside of itself, to produce the standard against which power itself can be measured, a reference point that the sovereign doesn't own, can't issue, and can't revoke. That is what it used to be for. That was the whole job of the priestly class. Modernity, however, abolished this function and handed its authority to the manager, and the manager, however, is structurally incapable of filling it, because a manager can only ever optimize. He can make the system faster, safer, more efficient, more inclusive, more fake and gay, and more compliant. He can't tell you, however, what it's for, because he has no access to a standard outside of the system, because he is the system, which means every modern ideology is now running without a real reference point above it. And a thing with no reference point doesn't really get to choose its destination. It will roll downhill, all the way to the bottom, to wherever its own material logic will dump it. That's why the endpoints are fixed, not because these ideologies are evil, not because evil men hijacked them, I'm sure they did, but because nothing is left that could call a halt, and mean it, from somewhere that the state doesn't own. Well, all of this is rather unnerving, isn't it? It makes me think of a meme. An all too familiar image. An astronaut floating in space looking down at the globe, down at everything that we have built, and the realization slowly lands on his face. That is us, my friends. Wait, it's all fascism? Behind him appears a second, far too familiar sounding figure. The pistol is already up, and the hammer is cocked.
Always has been!
That's the small mercy in the joke, isn't it? The truth always gets handed to you at the exact moment that it can no longer do any good. 1 second before the trigger is pulled, it all makes perfect sense. Why our freedoms keep turning into encroachments, what our democracy actually means, where the journey appears to be heading. Well, it doesn't really look like we can change it, at least in form, but what it really comes down to is the content. That is why we have to win. And maybe that is the most honest place to let you go here, not with a call to arms. There is no arms to call, my friends. You can't really vote this form out of office. We have to deal with the realization clearly and openly, so that we can find our own way through it. Fascism can't be defined by us, not really at least, because it would appear that we're in the middle of living it out. the total political mass movement, with the state as totalizing body, as a moral authority, and as the instrument of enforcement. The whole thing was the lens that we were looking through the entire time. And as such, thank you for your time.